There is a ring in the sky that has been watching human civilization since before civilization had a name for itself. It hangs there, cold and golden, wrapped in bands of ice and rock, and for thousands of years, people looking up at the night sky picked it out and gave it a name that still echoes through our calendars, our courtrooms, and our banks today. Saturn. Not just a planet. According to a theory that refuses to die, and no matter how many times it is debunked, Saturn is the mask worn by the oldest system of control on Earth, one that some claim still runs the modern world from behind the curtain, using symbols so common we stopped noticing them centuries ago. This is the story of that theory. Not because it is proven, it is not, but because millions of people have gone looking for it, and what they found along the way says something strange about how power, myth, and human imagination have always been tangled together. Start with the name itself, Saturday. The seventh day of the week in nearly every calendar on Earth named directly after Saturn, the Roman god of time, harvest, and limitation. Nobody questions it. It is just a word. But theorists ask why the day of rest, the day associated with slowing down, with boundaries, with the end of the working week, is the one day named after the god the Romans associated with restriction itself. Coincidence, most historians would say. The Romans named the days after the visible planets, full stop. And Saturn simply got Saturday because it was the slowest, most distant planet visible to the naked eye, the one that took nearly 30 years to complete a single orbit. But to those chasing the theory, that slowness is the whole point. Saturn was the planet of time because it moved so slowly it seemed to embody time's weight, its inevitability, the way it presses down on everything living. And once you accept that framing, the rest of the theory starts to unfold like a chain reaction. Go back to Rome itself, because this is where the documented history actually begins, long before anyone dressed it up in modern conspiracy language. The god Saturnus was worshipped across the Roman world as the deity of agriculture, of the harvest, of wealth, stored and hoarded, and crucially, of time itself. He was often shown as an old man carrying a sickle, the same image later borrowed wholesale for the figure of Father Time, and some argue for the Grim Reaper. His temple sat at the base of the Capitoline Hill in the Roman Forum, and it was not just a place of worship, it was the state treasury. The actual gold and silver reserves of the Roman Republic were kept inside Saturn's temple, guarded in his name. Financial records, state assets, the literal wealth of an empire, all housed under the protection of the god of time and limitation. Historians will tell you this was simply practical, since Saturn was associated with abundance and the accumulation of resources from the harvest, so it made a kind of religious sense to store the treasury there. But notice what that means either way. From the very beginning of recorded Western history, the god now linked to a secret ruling class was quite literally the god of money. Then there is Saturnalia, the festival held every December in his honor, and this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because the historical facts alone sound like conspiracy material without anyone needing to invent anything. For about a week, Roman society flipped upside down. Slaves were served by their masters. Gambling, normally illegal, was permitted openly in the streets. Businesses closed. Courts suspended their proceedings. People wore casual clothes instead of the formal toga. Gifts were exchanged. And a mock king, the Saturnalicious princeps, was chosen to preside over the chaos, often through a game of chance. It was a genuine, sanctioned inversion of the entire social order, a yearly reminder of the mythical golden age when Saturn ruled the earth, and there was no need for law, hierarchy, or property, because abundance was universal and nobody wanted for anything. Saturnalia was Rome's way of remembering that lost age of equality, even while the rest of the year was governed by strict Roman law and rigid class structure. Here is where theorists make their first real leap. Saturnalia's timing in late December, close to the winter solstice, sits suspiciously close to Christmas. The gift-giving, the temporary suspension of normal hierarchy, the general festive license, all of it maps uncomfortably well onto modern Christmas traditions that developed centuries later in a Christian context. Historians of religion have long noted the overlap and debated how much early Christian communities absorbed from existing Roman festival culture when Christianity became the empire's dominant religion. Mainstream scholarship treats this as a case of cultural continuity, the way new religious movements often adopt the shape of the festivals they are trying to replace, because people do not give up their holidays easily. But the version of this story that circulates in the corners of the internet, chasing the Saturn theory, takes it several steps further, framing it not as gradual cultural blending, but as evidence that the modern world's biggest holiday is, underneath the surface, still a festival to Saturn, just wearing new clothes. From here, the mythology digs even deeper, back past Rome into Greece, where Saturn's counterpart was Cronus, leader of the Titans, the primordial gods who ruled before the Olympians existed. And Cronus is where the story turns genuinely dark. According to the myth, Cronus was told by a prophecy that one of his own children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his own father, Uranus. So Cronus did something monstrous. He swallowed his children whole one by one the moment they were born, trying to prevent the prophecy by consuming the very future that threatened him. His wife Rhea eventually tricked him, hiding their youngest son and giving Cronus a stone wrapped in cloth to swallow instead. That hidden son was Zeus, who grew up in secret, returned as an adult, forced his father to disgorge his siblings, and led the overthrow of the Titans, becoming the new ruler of the cosmos. It is one of the oldest stories in Western mythology, and it is fundamentally a story about time devouring its own children, about the old order consuming the new to preserve itself, about a father so terrified of losing power that he destroys the very future he created. Theorists point out that Cronus, transliterated as Kronos in later Greek philosophy, became fused conceptually with the abstract idea of time itself. Even though linguists are clear, these were originally two separate words that simply sounded alike and got merged in the popular imagination over centuries. But once fused, the symbolism became irresistible to later mystics. Time devours everything. Every living thing that time creates, time eventually consumes. Cronus eating his children is, in this reading, simply a mythological way of saying that nothing born into time escapes being consumed by time eventually. It is a genuinely powerful piece of ancient philosophy, wrapped inside a horror story. And it is not hard to see why later occultists, centuries afterward, found in this myth a perfect metaphor for systems of power that consume the people living inside them while presenting themselves as natural, inevitable, unchangeable, the way time itself feels inevitable and unchangeable. This is the pivot point where the historical Saturn and the conspiratorial Saturn split off from each other, and the theory as we know it today really begins to take shape. Sometime in the last 2 centuries, occult writers, astrologers, and esoteric philosophers began treating Saturn not just as a mythological figure from the ancient past, but as an active symbolic force still operating in the modern world, an archetype of restriction, authority, hierarchy, and control that never went away. It simply changed its costume. In astrology, Saturn is still described this way today, completely mainstream within that practice. Saturn represents structure, discipline, boundaries, authority, karma, consequence, the parts of life that feel heavy and restrictive but ultimately teach responsibility. Astrologers call a difficult period, in a person's late 20s, a Saturn return, when the planet completes its first full orbit since your birth, and supposedly forces a reckoning with adult responsibility. None of this is conspiracy theory. It is simply how astrology, as a belief system, has described this planet for a very long time. But somewhere along the way, some writers took that symbolic language and applied it not to individual psychology, but to civilization as a whole, arguing that the entire structure of modern society, law, government, banking, timekeeping, education, marriage, and property, is itself a kind of Saturnian architecture, a system built to impose limitation and structure on human potential, the same way the myth describes Saturn imposing limitation on his own children. Courts and their black robes became, in this reading, modern priesthoods of Saturn, since black has long been associated with Saturn in esoteric color symbolism, representing the void, restriction, and the unknown. The scales of justice became a Saturnian symbol of measurement and judgment. Clocks and calendars, invented to divide time into measured units, became tools of a Saturnian system designed to fragment the natural, cyclical experience of time into something linear, controllable, and monetizable. Since, after all, we still say time is money. Wedding rings entered the theory, too, since Saturn's most recognizable feature is its rings, and some writers have argued the custom of the wedding band symbolically binds a person the way Saturn's rings bind its moons, an eternal circle representing not romantic commitment, but a kind of cosmic contract of restriction. Mainstream anthropologists trace the wedding ring back to ancient Egypt and Rome for entirely different reasons, tied to ideas of eternity and unbroken love, with no connection to Saturn whatsoever in the original sources. But the symbolic overlap was too tempting for theorists to ignore once they started looking for it everywhere. This is really the engine driving the entire modern version of the theory. And it is worth naming clearly because it explains why it keeps growing no matter how many individual claims get debunked. Once you accept the premise that Saturn represents restriction, structure, and control, you can find restriction, structure, and control absolutely everywhere, because those concepts are woven into nearly every human institution that has ever existed. Government is structure. Law is restriction. Banking is control over resources. Marriage is a structured contract. Time itself is a system of measured control over the chaos of lived experience. None of that requires an actual secret cult behind it. It simply requires that human civilization at some point needed structure to function at scale, and structure will always resemble the mythological qualities we assigned to Saturn thousands of years ago, because we built those myths in the first place, to describe exactly those qualities. The theory, in other words, may be finding its own reflection everywhere it looks, not because a hidden hand placed Saturn symbolism into every corner of modern life, but because Saturn was always a symbol for the very human tendency to build systems of order. And those systems are, unsurprisingly, everywhere. Still, the theory does not stop at abstract symbolism. It reaches for something more concrete, more sinister, the idea that specific groups of people across history have known this connection and used it deliberately, consciously, as a tool of power rather than an accident of language and myth. This is where secret societies enter the story. Writers pushing this theory point to genuine historical secret societies, groups like the Freemasons, various Rosicrucian orders, and older mystery schools from the ancient world, arguing that initiates within these groups preserved esoteric knowledge about planetary forces, including Saturn, and passed it down through carefully guarded rituals meant only for the highest levels of initiation. It is true that Freemasonry incorporates astronomical and astrological symbolism into some of its ritual language and architecture, a fact Freemasons themselves do not deny, since Masonic tradition has long drawn on classical philosophy, sacred geometry, and symbolic systems borrowed from multiple ancient traditions. But there is a significant gap between acknowledging that historical secret societies used symbolic language, borrowed from astrology, alchemy, and classical mythology, which is documented, and claiming that those same societies function today as a coordinated global network secretly worshipping Saturn and directing world events from the shadows, which has never been demonstrated with any verifiable evidence, despite decades of people searching for it. The theory gained new fuel in the modern era from an unexpected source, one that has nothing to do with ancient Rome at all, and everything to do with a photograph taken by an unmanned spacecraft nearly 2 billion miles from Earth. In the 1980s, and later confirmed in stunning detail by the Cassini spacecraft in the 2000s, NASA discovered something genuinely bizarre sitting at Saturn's North Pole. A massive persistent storm system shaped almost perfectly like a hexagon, a six-sided geometric structure of swirling atmosphere roughly 20,000 miles across, wide enough to fit several Earths inside it, and it has been there, holding its shape with eerie precision for as long as we have been able to observe it. Scientifically, this is a fascinating, and still not fully, understood phenomenon of atmospheric fluid dynamics, believed to be caused by the interaction of jet streams at different latitudes on the planet, something researchers have partially reproduced in laboratory experiments using rotating fluid tanks. But to occult writers and conspiracy theorists watching those images come back from space, a naturally occurring hexagon sitting on the very planet already associated with ancient ideas of control and restriction looked like confirmation of something they had suspected all along. The hexagon quickly became fused in this online mythology with the hexagram, the six-pointed star made of two overlapping triangles, a shape found in Jewish tradition as the Star of David, in various esoteric and alchemical traditions representing the union of opposites, and in occult numerology tied to the number 6, repeated 3 times, 6, 166. Writers began drawing a direct line from Saturn's newly photographed hexagon straight through to ancient religious symbolism and modern numerology of the beast, arguing this was proof that Saturn worship, hexagram symbolism, and hidden global control were all expressions of the same underlying system, one only now being confirmed by modern space photography. It needs to be said plainly that there is no historical evidence connecting Saturn, or its earlier names Cronus and Chiron, to the number 666, or to the hexagram shape anywhere in ancient Babylonian astrology, Greco-Roman religion, or historical Jewish tradition. This entire chain of associations was assembled after the fact, entirely in the modern era, stitched together from a real scientific discovery and pre-existing occult numerology that had nothing to do with each other until conspiracy writers put them side by side and declared the resemblance meaningful. This pattern repeats throughout the modern version of the theory, and once you notice it, it becomes hard to unsee. A real documented historical or scientific fact gets identified. Saturn was genuinely worshipped in Rome. Saturday genuinely gets its name from Saturn. The hexagonal storm genuinely exists and was genuinely photographed by NASA. Then a symbolic leap gets made, connecting that real fact to a completely separate tradition, myth, or modern institution based on visual or linguistic resemblance rather than any documented historical link. The wedding ring resembles Saturn's rings, therefore marriage is Saturnian. The judge's robe is black, and black is Saturn's color, therefore the justice system is Saturnian. the hexagon, resembles the hexagram, and the hexagram contains 6 sides doubled into 6 points. Therefore, Saturn is connected to ancient numerology of the number of the beast. Each individual leap feels almost plausible in isolation, especially presented with confident narration and dramatic music, which is exactly the format this theory tends to spread through online. But stacked together across dozens of these leaps, the theory becomes something closer to a hall of mirrors where every reflection looks like confirmation, simply because the theory keeps redefining what counts as evidence to include almost anything with a passing visual resemblance. There is also a darker thread woven through parts of this online conspiracy world that deserves honest acknowledgement rather than a polite silence. Some versions of the Saturn cult theory drift into far older and more dangerous conspiracy traditions, the kind that claim a small, ancient bloodline of families has secretly controlled global finance, government, and media for centuries, hoarding esoteric knowledge while the rest of humanity remains deliberately kept in the dark. These bloodline and hidden elite narratives have a long, well-documented history of being used to target specific ethnic and religious communities with baseless accusations of secret world domination, and unfortunately, some corners of the Saturn theory borrow directly from that older, harmful playbook, simply relabeling the accused conspirators as Saturn worshippers instead of naming groups directly. It is worth staying alert to that pattern if you go looking through this material yourself, because a theory about an ancient planet, God, can become a vehicle for recycling much older and more harmful conspiracies, dressed up in new symbolic language that makes the underlying accusation harder to immediately recognize. Setting that darker thread aside, most people who find themselves fascinated by this theory are not chasing anything sinister at all. They are responding to something genuinely compelling about the core idea, the sense that the systems governing modern life, our courts, our calendars, our financial structures, our holidays, feel oddly disconnected from any obvious human designer, as though they simply exist, permanent and unquestionable, the way gravity exists. The Saturn theory offers an explanation for that feeling. It says these systems were designed deliberately by someone, even if that someone remains hidden and that the ancient myths were actually trying to warn us about exactly this, encoding the truth in symbolic language, because direct warnings would have been suppressed. It is, in its own way, a comforting explanation, because a designed system, however sinister, is more comprehensible than the alternative, which is that human civilization built these vast, restrictive structures gradually, through millions of individual decisions, across thousands of years, with no single guiding hand at all, just the accumulated weight of countless people trying to organize survival, resources, and cooperation at increasing scale. That accumulated weight is, in the end, the far better documented explanation for why modern life feels so structured, so bound by law, time, and hierarchy. Large societies require coordination. Coordination requires shared systems of time, measurement, law, and exchange. Every civilization on Earth that grew beyond a certain size independently developed calendars, courts, currencies, and marriage customs, not because they were copying a Saturnian template handed down through secret societies, but because these are the practical tools any sufficiently large group of humans eventually needs to function without collapsing into chaos. The Aztec, the Chinese, the Egyptian, and the Roman. Civilizations all developed remarkably similar structures of law, calendar, and currency, almost entirely independently of each other, separated by oceans and centuries, which is much harder to explain through a single hidden global cult, and much easier to explain through the simple fact that large human societies converge on similar solutions to the same coordination problems. None of this means the myths themselves are meaningless, or that there is nothing worth taking from the story of Saturn beyond debunking a conspiracy theory. The figure of Saturn, across every version of his myth, from devouring Titan to god of the treasury to keeps returning to the same core idea, that time is the ultimate authority none of us escape. That every structure we build to organize our lives eventually becomes a kind of cage even when we built it for good reasons, and that real freedom seems to require an honest reckoning with limitation rather than a fantasy of escaping it entirely. Saturnalia, at its core, was not really about worshipping restriction. It was about remembering, once a year, what life might look like without it, and then returning deliberately to the structure the rest of the year required, having been reminded that the structure was a choice, not an inevitability. That is a genuinely useful piece of ancient wisdom, whether or not you believe a hidden cult has been operating behind it for 2,000 years. So where does that leave the theory itself, the one claiming a hidden cult of Saturn secretly rules the modern world? The honest answer is that it leaves it exactly where it started, as a compelling piece of modern folklore built from real historical fragments, real mythology, a real and striking space, photograph, and a very human desire to find hidden meaning and hidden agency behind the parts of civilization that feel too vast and impersonal to have simply grown that way on their own. There is no verified evidence of an organized group calling itself the Cult of Saturn, secretly directing global governments, banks, or courts from behind the scenes. What there is, undeniably, is a rich vein of genuine ancient religion, genuine occult symbolism developed over centuries by real esoteric traditions, and a modern internet culture extremely skilled at connecting all of it into a narrative that feels too coherent to be coincidence, even when each individual connection, examined on its own, turns out to rest on resemblance rather than evidence. Maybe that is the real story worth telling here, not a hidden cult ruling from the shadows, but the very real and very human cult of pattern recognition, the deep, ancient wiring in the human mind that sees a hexagon on a planet 2 billion miles away and cannot help but connect it to a six-pointed star, a black judge's robe, and a wedding ring. Because finding hidden patterns, even false ones, has always felt safer than accepting a universe and a civilization built largely by accident, one incremental human decision at a time, with no one single hand steering it at all.